Welcome to today's webinar, Expanding Access to Pedestrian Infrastructure and Improving Public Safety, Tools and Case Studies, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in coordination with the Maryland Department of Transportation and our many Walktober partners. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and host of the Walktober Walkinar series. Walking is an activity that many of us take for granted. But as pedestrian accident rates continue to rise and access to safe pedestrian spaces is diminished, communities are recognizing that walking and improving the walkability of our neighborhoods requires public attention and action. Throughout October, the Maryland Department of Transportation, in coordination with several state agencies and other partners, is sponsoring a series of webinars or walkinars to highlight how we can collectively rally around walking, an activity that is both central to the state's active transportation efforts and a critical component promoting public well-being. This is the fourth in a four-part series that we will be hosting every Thursday morning this month. Thank you for joining us today and throughout the month. For more information about Walktober, please visit mdot.maryland.gov/Walktober or visit smartgrowth.org and click on the Walktober Walkinars link. The Maryland Department of Planning also hosts a national webinar series in association with the Smart Growth Network on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it online. All participants today will receive an email with a link to the recording once it is posted. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, as well as 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Expanding Access to Pedestrian Infrastructure and Improving Public Safety, Tools and Case Studies. You can also search for event number 925914. So today our speakers are Stephanie DiPetrillo, Carden Wyckoff, and Jessie Cohn McGowan. Stephanie DiPetrillo is a senior research specialist at the Ellen M. Voorhees Transportation Center and an adjunct professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on the intersection of transportation and land use. Using mixed methods approaches, she examines ways to improve transit service quality and access for all users and investigates ways to promote the use of public and community transportation through improvements in the built environment, transit-oriented development, and service design. This work has been undertaken for the Federal Transit Administration, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, state-level departments of transportation and human services, and transit agencies. She serves on the American Public Transportation Association Workforce Development Committee, the Sustainable Jersey Land Use Task Force, and is a friend to the Economic Development and Land Use Committee and Standing Committee on Accessible Transportation and Mobility at the Transportation Research Board. Next, Carden Wyckoff is an Atlanta native, disability advocate, wheelchair roller, transit rider, and change maker. She is known for bringing strategy to organizations and does this most frequently by being able to come up with innovative ideas that lead to creating efficiencies. She serves on the board of directors for the FSHD Society, the MARTA Army, and Propel ATL, and works in digital accessibility for a Fortune 500 company in Atlanta. Diagnosed at the age of 8, Carden has a form of muscular dystrophy, FSHD, that is a progressive muscle wasting disease. Instead of letting the disability define her, she transforms her community to be a more accessible place. Carden's most recent initiative has been launching an accessibility podcast called Freewheelin' with Carden to share stories of people with various disabilities and to educate the public on accessibility-related topics. Finally, Jessie Cohn McGowan is an associate at Sam Schwartz Engineering in Jersey City, New Jersey. Previously, she served as a transportation planner for the Montgomery County Planning Department in Maryland, where she led Vision Zero and transit planning. Her presentation today focuses on her work in Montgomery County. Jessie has 10 years of transportation planning experience, and she is passionate about making multimodal transportation options accessible, affordable, and safe for all. She has a master's degree in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Brown University. Following their presentations, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And before we get started today, we're going to share a brief video from MDOT Secretary Jim Ports introducing today's Walktober Walkinar program.
Hello, I'm Jim Ports, Secretary for the Maryland Department of Transportation. Thank you for being here today as we celebrate Maryland's third annual Walktober, a month-long series of activities and educational events to promote safe walking and walkability. Following the successes of previous years, we're pleased to continue hosting a series of 4 webinars, or Walkinars as we call them, each Thursday throughout the month. These Walkinars highlight innovative practices to support walking and walkability and provide important information on safety, equity, health, and infrastructure. To learn more about Walktober and to find resources and events happening throughout the month, please visit our website. Today's Walkinar will take a look at tools and case studies focusing on expanding access to pedestrian infrastructure and improving public safety. We'll hear from Stephanie DiPetrillo, Senior Research Specialist with the Alan M. Voorhees Transportation Center, Jesse Cohn McGowan, and David Anspacher with Montgomery County Planning Department, and Carden Wyckoff, Disability Advocate, Wheelchair Roller, Transit Rider, and Changemaker. I'm excited for today's event. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the presentation.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie DiPetrillo of Rutgers. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me. As I was said, I'm Stephanie DiPetrillo. I'm a senior researcher at the Alan M. Voorhees Transportation Center at Rutgers University in New Jersey. The Voorhees Transportation Center, or VTC, is a research center housed within the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Thank you for inviting me to join the session today and for letting me talk a little bit about my work. For the past, 1 second, doesn't want to advance, of course.
You have to make you have to make your slides the focus.
I have to make the slides the focus. I knew I would screw this up. Is that correct? Does that work?
Yeah, you were just toggling back and forth between slides there.
You just need to click. You just need to click directly in the middle of your slide.
No, that does not. That worked. Thank you. For the past several years, my work has concentrated on 2 areas, both of which are related to our topic today. A good deal of my work looks at transit-oriented development, or TOD. This is the idea that by coordinating transportation planning and land use, we can encourage people to live in places well served by public transportation, and thereby encourage them to travel more frequently by bus, light rail, or rail, and less frequently by privately owned vehicles, meaning cars. Regarding this work, a lot of it looks at issues here in New Jersey, where I lead the njtod.org project, an online resource that provides municipal officials, planners, and advocates with information on the potential for development and redevelopment around transit facilities. I often work in partnership with my colleagues at the Transit Friendly Planning Program at New Jersey Transit, our statewide public transit agency. Another area of my research looks at improving transportation options for people who are, as we say, transportation disadvantaged, a catch-all phrase for older adults, people with disabilities, low-income persons, and veterans and others. This photo was taken at a recent engagement event that's part of our work with the Morris County Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan. Where these 2 areas of research come together for me is literally the sidewalk. What I mean by this is that to encourage more people to live in transit-rich locations and better serve the needs of those living and working and visiting these places, and to better serve the needs of those who we call transportation disadvantaged, we need to think about how people walk or bike or roll, and how we build places that accommodates the needs of all users. In terms of transit-oriented development or planning for transit-friendly places, people often get caught up with the debate about how far people will walk to get to a transit facility, a bus stop, or a rail station, or what the size of a TOD, what is the size of a TOD district, whether it is important to think about TOD areas as being within a quarter mile of a station or stop or a half mile of a station or stop. This issue continues to be important for the adoption of sharing and micromobility options such as bike shares and scooters and e-bikes, as these options extend the range of what should be considered a transit area. But in addition to this, I'm concerned with the quality of that walk rather than the length of that walk. The reason is that research has shown that people are much more likely to walk to a transit facility and to walk longer distances if the transit facility is of high quality. We actually wrote about this recently on the njtod.org site, and if you would like to read about that, we can share a link to that article. So what do I mean by high quality? Well, at a minimum, is the walk to a transit station or stop seems safe? Would you as a pedestrian be and feel safe from cars and trucks on the road? Would you be and feel safe from potential crime along the walk? Beyond this, is the walk to the transit station or stop interesting? And then better still, is the walk to a transit station or stop useful or maybe even enjoyable? Can you as the person walking to and from a station or stop do some or all of your personal business along the way? Can you grab a cup of coffee? Can you go to the bank? Can you pick up a prescription, a newspaper, library books? Can you buy groceries or get something for dinner? Are there things of interest happening along your walk? Are there storefronts to check out? Or is there activity on the street? Are there people about? Are there flowers, trees? You know, is there music? These are all sort of things that we think about for places that are of high quality, that make a high quality walk. This one location that I'm showing right now is Metuchen. It is one of the New Jersey transit villages and a place that has received a lot of attention here in New Jersey. But let's think about these ideas again. This time, let's think about them in terms of whether a walk serves the needs of people of all abilities. So why is this important? Because when the pathway from one's home to a transit station or stop is quote unquote broken, when there is a gap in the network that connects an older adult or a person with disabilities to the, when there's a gap in that network that connects an older adult or a person with disabilities to a transit station or stop, then that person is often unable to use the transit system. Instead, they must rely on other forms of transportation or often limit the trips they take, which can affect their ability to address their basic needs, to hold a job, let alone to participate in a host of activities that affect their quality of life. For them, it's not just about the walk being less pleasant, but that the walk can be considerably more dangerous, or that the walk between home or the transit station or stop cannot be made at all. Case in point, a recent study by researchers at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, this was recently released, they found that access was the biggest issue for people trying to meet their needs, for seniors trying to meet their needs, including medical needs. It said that amongst the findings were that older adults who used wheelchairs were 65% less likely to use public transportation because of the difficulty in getting to places, and that older adults that lived in areas with broken or cracked sidewalks were also less likely to use transit. So it's for this reason that it's essential to improve the pathways to transit for people of all abilities. Improving these pathways to transit can be challenging, however, in part because the stakeholders and decision makers involved in the process can be wide-ranging and include public officials, private landowners, transit agency representatives, and others. And because improving pathways to transit can be can require considerable resources and expertise. From our work, we undertook some work a few years back, and from our work on that project, we arrived at some recommendations on how to move forward with improving pathways to transit. These recommendations come from work that I did in collaboration with researchers at UCLA and the University of South Florida. We found that a multi-pronged approach towards making improvements in the pathways to transit that allows that, let me refrain, that these recommendations allow people to move forward in making improvements. Most importantly, understanding the needs of all riders of all abilities through direct engagement, evaluation of routes, and ongoing data collection efforts to monitor progress. By pursuing partnerships between transit agencies, metropolitan transit organizations, local governments, and advocacy groups to promote connectivity between land use and transit, and for allowing cost sharing. This we find is especially in the state of New Jersey, where we have a rather desperate system by which we get things done. Partnership is really the only way this happens, is by figuring out who all the people are, that all the organizations that need to be involved to make decisions, because otherwise you're only working on a small part of the problem. Communicating plans within your organizations, amongst other organizations, and with the public. Approaching costing and funding issues creatively to explore less expensive means to meet goals and pooling resources. Thinking holistically about projects to more closely align transportation services with consumer needs. And incorporating new technologies while taking into consideration long-term uses, long-term costs, reuse of materials, and the use of green materials. Ultimately, transit agencies and local governments should understand that improving the pathways to transit enhance travel for all users. The true measure of success is a seamless trip from origin to destination. One last thought to keep in mind when considering ways to improve walking conditions for transit-friendly places and for connecting pathways to transit stations and stops is the idea of universal design. This is the idea that design should meet the needs of all users rather than providing an accommodation for some users. I show this example from the New Brunswick train station. In this case, a change in elevation from the street to the westbound platform allowed for an all-purpose ramp that provided access to the station. It's really one of the more interesting applications that has happened, and allows a free flow of passengers and people walking. And I show it as an example. Thank you again for inviting me to speak. And now I will turn over the floor to Carden Wyckoff.
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie. And hopefully everyone can see that. My name is Carden Wyckoff. I am Atlanta-based, and I am a wheelchair user. I do not have a car. I rely fully on mass transportation. In Atlanta, it's called MARTA, and I use sidewalks and bike lanes. And so really just want to paint a picture of a very contrasting experience. Stephanie showed you all the really pretty pictures, and now I'm going to show you the opposite of that, which is what happens and the impact that it has on me as a wheelchair user who is a pedestrian when infrastructure is not at the best quality. You can find me on Twitter at Carden on Wheels. I do a lot of tweeting on transit equity. So me as a wheelchair user and pedestrian, it feels like I'm constantly battling this state of a war against cars, a war on cars. Cars are in the sidewalk, cars are in bike lanes, cars are hitting infrastructure and destroying it, like the pedestrian signal in the bottom right corner. Cars are destroying and damaging the bike lane flex posts and the bollards. And not here by any means. Cars have a time and a place to get to where you need to go. However, let's talk about a little bit about my experience. So what happens when I come to one of these obstacles? So we'll take the example, there are two cars parked on the sidewalk facing perpendicular to it, and then there's another row of cars that are parked on the street. So in this example, I do not have the ability, my right of way is completely blocked. So I will then have to jump off the curb with my wheelchair and go into the street. Thankfully, where that location was, it's a side street. It's not as heavily trafficked, and this is also a restaurant valet parking. So when we're thinking about design, how do we think about it in a practical way that the restaurant can have valet parking, but it's not blocking pedestrians with disabilities, or really rather any pedestrian? The right of way should never be blocked for pedestrians. Similarly, there's another car parked on the sidewalk to unload and load. This is a common scenario that I see at this club just a couple blocks away from me. And again, I roll in the street in this situation. Then we come to sidewalks, right? And so I will let you know that all these pictures have been taken in Atlanta in the last year. This is my experience. Actually, this past week being in Atlanta, I was en route. I had gotten off MARTA, our train system, and was rolling on the sidewalk to the mayor's town hall, which he had a couple of these, and I came across a double sidewalk closure. Now, this is an arterial where this took place, and so that term means that is extremely heavy volume of traffic. It is very dangerous for a pedestrian to pedestrians should not go into the street because it's very high volume, fast, high speeds. And the problem here, though, is that I didn't have another option. There was no way even for me to go into the parking lot around this double sidewalk closure. And so if you are working for the city, start thinking about these things of preventing permitting for double sidewalk closures. What is the path of travel going to look like when you do a sidewalk closure? Another thing we see often are sidewalks that are uprooted by trees, or there's potholes, right? There's wear and tear on any infrastructure. Ensuring that your users have the ability to have a reporting system. So in Atlanta, it's called ATL 311, and we can log and report any sidewalk issue. And usually if it's ADA, in regards to ADA, it gets resolved usually within 6 months to a year, which is a pretty quick turnaround time. And I'm always snapping pictures and uploading them to ATL 311. And then additionally with sidewalk closures, ensuring that there's proper signage, not just immediately in front of the closure, but at the nearest crosswalk or intersection on both ends of the blockage. And the reason for that is because if I'm rolling down, for example, in Atlanta, sometimes crosswalks are far away. We don't really have a great block system unless you're downtown in the city. But it may be a quarter of a mile that I'm traveling from, say, the nearest intersection. And so if I come all the way down the sidewalk and then I now see a sign that says sidewalk closed and I wasn't notified ahead of time, that drains my battery because I use a power wheelchair. It also is really frustrating because I didn't plan for that in my route and in my path of travel. Other cities where I've seen success is with sidewalk closures is ensuring that there is a temporary route for pedestrians and ensuring that you have the proper safety, that if for example, with this double sidewalk closure, ensuring that there is a car lane taken away and to route pedestrian traffic around that. In this specific example, the mayor told me that the reason that this particular issue happened is because the city of Atlanta was repairing one side of the sidewalk and the improvement district, the neighborhood improvement district, MPU, was repairing the other side of the sidewalk. And there wasn't communication between the two parties that they were both repairing the sidewalk both either sides of the sidewalk at the same time. And so communication between all of the different partners that are working on fixing your infrastructure in the city is so important. Now, advocacy. What are the things that I do to help make the city of Atlanta and just other cities in general better for pedestrian experiences? And Stephanie, you talked about last mile transit, you talked about getting to the bus stop. You know, I rely on buses and trains, and so the sidewalk experience, the bike lane experience, curb cuts, those are all things that I think about. I organized a protest. The mayor was going to take away tactical urbanism at one of our downtown spots. And one of the pictures here shows a few of the protesters were holding signs like "Stop the Demo," pedestrian safety, save, share Peachtree, because we were sharing the road with pedestrian bicycle users. We have tactical urbanism, and this is good for a strip of the sidewalk, or sorry, a strip of the street that doesn't have high volume of traffic and or high speeds of traffic, because it's obviously not as robust as, say, concrete infrastructure. So we have bulb outs, corner bulb outs along the corners to reduce the turning radius of cars and expand the visibility, and also increase or decrease the distance from across the intersection in the crosswalk. And we have wheel stops and some flex posts and planters as well. So in those shared spaces, bicycles can roll in them, scooters, wheelchairs, etc. And then we also have a sorry, I'm looking on the crisscross, a scramble, sorry, pedestrian scramble at this location as well. And so pedestrians were able to cross any number of ways. They didn't have to go perpendicular to each other. You could cross diagonally. Additionally, with curb cuts and or whether you're near valet parking, whether you're near parking lots of restaurants, ensuring that those curb cuts are not blocked by cars. And so in another picture I have below is there was an issue where cars would frequently block the curb cut. And so I reported that the city of Atlanta should stripe the no parking yellow lines in front of the curb cut. And that really has helped reduce car parking. It's not perfect. The other thing we have seen a lot with cities, especially with the pandemic, is these placemaking projects and the importance of neighborhood seating, community seating. And a lot of times those are quick builds using materials that you have maybe in your backyard, or maybe it was donated, and ensuring that those spaces are wheelchair accessible. So if oftentimes they're off the curb, and so making sure that you have ramps or thresholds that will allow wheelchair accessibility. It's my dad, actually. It's in Atlanta. It's one of the projects that I helped design with the city to make sure that it was accessible. It was a cool project that we worked on. And then finally, you know, I've been an advocate for, oh gosh, a very long time, over a decade now. This is a picture of me on my college campus, the University of Georgia. At all of the bus stops, there were lacking curb cuts to cross, and so I helped to advocate for that. And by the time that I graduated, every bus stop on the University of Georgia's campus had crosswalks at each of the bus stops. And there was a lot of news and press media around it. And then finally, I think it got cut off a little bit, but being on the board of directors for a couple of pedestrian safety and bicycle safety organizations, one of them, Marta Army, we did a bus stop census where we rated and reviewed over 3,000 bus stops on pedestrian safety, crosswalk lighting, and you can look at it on our website, martaarmy.org, and we can give you the playbook and the framework for how to rate your bus stops. Because as Stephanie was also mentioning, you know, getting to transportation, getting to bus stops is so important for, you know, people that live in the city, right? And those that maybe want to change going from relying fully on a car to now starting to use transportation. And so ensuring that you have high quality sidewalks, ensuring that you have great lighting, and that users feel safe at the end of the day. Atlanta is notoriously bad for sidewalks and bus stops, but we have to start somewhere, and getting the data is one of the great things to work to make your sidewalks in your cities better. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass it over to Jesse.
Hello, I'm not sure that I'm sharing the correct screen, so I'm going to maybe turn that off for a second. Let's see. There we go. So can you confirm you can see my presentation now?
Confirmed.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Jessie McGowan. I'm an associate at Sam Schwartz, but that's a relatively new role for me. I was previously working at the planning department in Montgomery County, Maryland, and so I'll be talking today about a safety project I did in Montgomery County. Given this is a Maryland Department of Transportation webinar, I imagine many of you are familiar with Montgomery County, but it is a county of about 1 million people just north of Washington, D.C. And so I'm going to be talking today about the predictive safety analysis. So historically, transportation planners have often looked to the past to say, where have there been crashes? You know, let's look at where there have been injuries or fatalities, and let's make changes at those locations. However, that's a really reactive approach, right? We're waiting for something terrible to happen before we make changes. And so the predictive safety analysis in this project really says, you know, we need to take a more proactive approach to transportation planning. We need to be making changes to our roadway network before something terrible occurs. So what we did as part of this effort is we estimated the expected number of crashes at intersections and segments for key crash types throughout Montgomery County. And so I'll talk more, you know, throughout this presentation about what that entailed, but essentially using some of these variables you see on the right, we looked at what are the different things that contribute to crash risk. And by doing this, we were able both to better understand our safety challenges within Montgomery County, as well as what are potential solutions to reduce crashes. And this work was done in partnership with the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. So you may be wondering why it is that we predicted crashes, or that we had to kind of model and estimate the number of crashes rather than just looking to crash history. Well, crash history is actually a little bit biased, right? We may have two intersections that look very similar, have similar number of lanes and speeds and maybe volumes, but we see that one has had you know, maybe one fatal crash while the other has not, and that's kind of a level of randomness to where crashes occur. And so the crash risk may be the same at two locations, but the crash history may be different. And so what we're really doing as part of the predictive safety analysis is looking at crash risk and understanding where is it likely that things could happen in the future. And relying on crash history can be particularly problematic when it comes to bicycle crashes and sometimes pedestrian crashes, because these are relatively rare. You know, we still do have bicycle and pedestrian crashes in Montgomery County, but given how few there are relative to motor vehicle crashes, it's sometimes hard to identify trends based on that data. So using something like crash risk can give us a better understanding of countywide issues related to pedestrian and bicycle safety. So I'm going to walk through each of the steps we took as part of this project. So this is just a brief overview on the screen, and then I'll talk in a little bit of detail about each of these elements. So the first thing that we did was we compiled the data. This was a really data-intensive project. So for each of these variables that you see on the screen, we captured this information at every segment and intersection throughout Montgomery County. So we looked at some common transportation characteristics like speed limit, number of lanes, etc. We looked at the presence of bicycle and pedestrian facilities, as well as looking at lighting and transit service. And this is kind of just a high level of overview of these variables. We really had quite a few more than what's listed on the screen. We also looked at land use characteristics, so understanding is this segment or intersection near different types of land uses? Is it near a park or a hospital or a job center or maybe an alcohol serving institution, whether that's a liquor store where people, purchase and carry out, or a bar or restaurant where people may be drinking on the premises. Lastly, we looked at demographic characteristics. So within the DC area, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments has designated several areas as equity emphasis areas based on the concentration of low-income households or people of color in those areas. And so we also integrated a lot of variables related to as I just mentioned, race and income, but also looking at people with disabilities, language access, age, et cetera. And so you'll hear throughout this presentation that equity was really a theme. And so in order to, really carry that theme through, we needed to start at the beginning by integrating this data. But one key piece of data that we were missing at the county was understanding activity. So, and here, it's listed as estimated volumes. So we wanted to understand how many people are walking, biking, or driving through a given intersection or along a given segment on any day. And this is important because, as I imagine many of you on the call know, that exposure or activity tends to be associated with crashes. And so, if there's no one walking through an intersection, there's not going to be any pedestrian crashes there. And we see that intersections that have higher volumes of motor vehicles tend to have higher crashes. And so we compiled about 600 different short-term counts throughout the county from development projects from our partners at the Department of Transportation and the State Highway Administration. And we developed models that estimated the expected number of daily bicycle, pedestrian, and motor vehicle trips throughout the county based on those transportation, land use, and demographic attributes. And this is kind of an added benefit of this project. While it is an input to additional steps that I'll talk about, we now also have this estimate of activity throughout the county that we can use on other efforts beyond this safety study. So once we've compiled all the data and we've calculated our volumes, it was then important for us to really narrow in on what we wanted to study as part of this project. So we identified 6 key crash types that we studied as part of the predictive safety analysis, but we didn't want to define the problem so broadly as why do pedestrian crashes occur? Because by defining the problem so broadly, the number of solutions is going to be really broad as well. We wanted to narrow in on a few common crash types so that we could then identify what are the safety solutions that can really reduce these types of crashes. And so we focused on crash types that were associated with a higher severity rate. So for example, rear ends are very common, but they don't tend to result in injuries or severe injuries or fatalities. And so that's not something we studied as part of this project. We focused on crash types that tended to be associated with more severe outcomes. And so we ultimately focused on 6 crash types. We looked at pedestrian crashes after dark at intersections, pedestrian crashes along segments with vehicles going straight. We looked at bicycle crashes at intersections. We looked at left turn crashes at intersections, and this looked at all modes, so bicycle, pedestrian, and motor vehicle crashes. We looked at straight angle crashes at intersections. You can see in this icon on the right what that crash type looks like. And then lastly, we looked at single vehicle crashes on segments. This is also sometimes referred to as run off the road. I also want to note that another way in which we selected these crash types was, again, thinking about equity. And so we wanted to ensure that we identified crash types that were prevalent in our equity emphasis areas and that we weren't focusing our study on something that would only improve safety in the affluent parts of the county. So with these 6 crash types, we actually have really great coverage of the severe injuries and fatalities throughout the county. So with these 6 crash types, we've accounted for about 3/4 of the pedestrian crashes, pedestrian severe injuries and fatalities, 65% of bicycle severe injuries and fatalities, and 40% of those related to motor vehicles. And so overall, these 6 crash types account for about half the severe injuries and fatalities in Montgomery County during the time period that we studied. And you may be thinking, well, I don't know that 50% is that good. Actually, this is a pretty great number given how few crash types we're looking at. And this is pretty comparable to what you often see with something like a high injury network that, really narrows in on some priority locations to focus on. And so once we've identified our crash types, it's now time to really get into the meat of the project, which is why are these crashes occurring and where are they occurring? And so this is just an illustrative example, but these equations that we developed are called safety performance functions. It's kind of just a wonky term for an equation or algorithm that explains the factors relating to where crashes occur. And so here in this example, we see that pedestrian crashes at intersections could be the result of pedestrian and motor vehicle volumes based on speed limits, how many approaches or legs come together at an intersection, or the number of high visibility crosswalks. And so I'm not going to walk through the results of all of our safety performance functions, but I'll just talk about this one as an example. So we looked at pedestrian segment crashes with vehicles going straight. Here on the right, you can see which variables had kind of a positive correlation or negative correlation with the number of crashes of that type. So as I kind of have mentioned a few times throughout this presentation, we did see that pedestrian traffic and motor vehicle traffic were associated with more crashes. So, you know, our areas that have more pedestrian activity, we're likely to see more of these pedestrian crashes in those areas. I do want to note that what we found with a variety of our variables related to transportation was that often, even though we'd already accounted for exposure, other transportation variables that were related to exposure tended to have a positive relationship to crashes. So we often saw that having a signalized intersection was associated with more crashes. And that's not to say that signalized intersections are bad and we shouldn't install them, but it's saying that, you know, we put signalized intersections or signals at intersections that already have a high volume of vehicles, and we need to be thinking about what else do we need to do at those intersections to improve safety. So similarly here, we see that segments that have some number of mid-block marked crosswalks tend to have more crashes. And that's not saying let's not put in marked crosswalks, but it's saying what else do we need to do at these mid-block crossings to make it safe for pedestrians that are trying to cross the street. Lastly, I want to note that, you know, we did look at several demographic variables. And so one thing that we found here was that higher income areas tended to have fewer pedestrian crashes. There's definitely an equity issue that lower income areas were associated with more pedestrian crashes. And so, you know, again, this is helping us kind of pinpoint where are the problem areas in Montgomery County and where should we focus our resources in order to improve safety. And so I just want to, before I move on, talk a little bit and dive a little bit deeper into why we did these crash predictions versus just looking at observed crashes. So our crash predictions are kind of our crash risk that we see on this y-axis, and then the x-axis is showing observed crashes. And so, you know, first, if we say, okay, well, where are these in agreement? We see that where there's low crash risk and low observed crashes, it's pretty clear that those are locations that are not a priority. We don't need to focus our resources in those locations. Where we see that there are locations similarly, you know, where there's agreement that there's high crash risk and high observed crashes, we really need to be prioritizing improvements at these locations. Next, if we look at the top left, these are locations that maybe don't have a history of crashes, but our models have shown high crash risk. And this is really where the benefit of this predictive safety analysis comes through. These are areas that have not maybe had a fatality or severe injury in the past, but look a lot like the places that have had those tragic incidents occur. And so these are places that we should really be making changes before something potentially occurs at those intersections or segments. And then lastly, if we look at this bottom right corner where we have low crash risk and a high history of crashes, these are intersections or segments that maybe require some more manual review. There may be safety issues here that are really kind of one-offs or things that we couldn't capture in the model. Perhaps the intersection skew of the intersection, the way that the intersection legs come in, make it such that visibility is poor, or maybe there's even just foliage that's overgrown at, you know, one of these corners that's impacting the sight distance. And so by having both the observed crashes and this crash risk metric, we really can kind of think holistically about how to address safety throughout the county. So now that we've developed these safety performance functions, we can really use this information to understand where there's risk in Montgomery County. And so first, we looked at essentially 3 metrics throughout this. So first, we looked at total annual crash risk, which is essentially the sum of crash risk. So how many crashes are expected in downtowns, or how many crashes are expected in equity areas. Next, we looked at a hotspot analysis, which essentially takes the top 200 locations for each crash type and says, where are these occurring? Are most of our worst locations in those downtowns or in the suburban areas, et cetera? And then lastly, we looked at average annual crash risk, which is kind of saying for any given intersection in a downtown or an equity area, what's the likelihood that a crash is going to happen here? And so I have a link at the bottom, and I think that John's going to put it in the chat, which can take you to a map to look at these top 200 locations for that hotspot analysis. So first, I'm going to share these results related to our equity emphasis areas versus the non-equity areas. And so the highlighted cells show the highest value for any column within these subsections. So because most of Montgomery County is not in an equity emphasis area, it's not surprising that overall the number of expected crashes is higher in the more affluent parts of the county. However, when we get to the hotspot analysis, those top 200 locations, we see that particularly for these pedestrian crash types, over 100 of the top 200 locations are in our equity areas. And so, it's really kind of showing a disparity that we need to be focusing on these locations when we're prioritizing improvements. And then this trend really jumps out more when we look at the average crash risk. So for any intersection in an equity area, the crash risk is significantly higher than it is in the non-equity areas. So we see that for the pedestrian crash type specifically, 270% higher in the equity areas for pedestrian crashes after dark and 226% higher for pedestrian crashes along segments. And, I imagine none of this is really surprising, but it does kind of confirm what we've seen in other data analyses about the disparities when it comes to pedestrian crashes and crashes overall in our most disadvantaged communities. I also wanted to show a quick comparison with our different areas, different kind of land use contexts throughout Montgomery County. So we looked at downtowns, which are kind of the densest parts of the county, town centers, which are kind of smaller urban nodes, and then suburban and country areas. And again, because most of the county is suburban, it's not surprising that we see that most of the crashes are expected to occur in our suburban areas. However, when we get to the hotspots, again, we see that these pedestrian crashes jump out. And so 88 of the top 200 locations for pedestrian crashes after dark are in our downtowns, and 75 of those top 200 locations for pedestrian crashes along segments are in our town centers. And so while you may think in looking at this top band that, we really have suburban issues that we need to work on, as we work our way down this chart, we see that we can't neglect our downtowns and town centers when we think about how we prioritize safety, particularly when it comes to pedestrians. And then lastly, when we look at the average crash risk, this kind of trend continues where we see that at any given intersection in a downtown, the likelihood of a crash is higher than it is in our suburban areas, particularly again for our bicycle and pedestrian crashes. The only exception is our single vehicle crashes, which are most likely to occur in country areas. And that's not surprising given that this is kind of as I mentioned earlier, a run off the road crash. So another thing I want to highlight in how we analyze this information was thinking about the concentration of crash risk. So, are there really just a few bad apples in the bunch that are where all of these crashes are expected to occur, or is it more dispersed throughout the county? And so what we see is that for 3 crash types, 200 locations really have about half of the crash risk in Montgomery County. So this is saying, if we were to make improvements at 200 locations, while a big number, we can really make a dent in safety and progress towards Vision Zero. For these other 3 crash types, we see that they tend to be a bit more dispersed. And so here we're going to need to think more about what are the systemic solutions that we can do at dozens, if not hundreds of locations. What are those low-cost systemic improvements that we can make to incrementally work away at reducing crash risk and improving safety for these crash types? And so just kind of summarize this section, I think it's important to balance those 3 metrics I was sharing. We want to look at total crash risk, hotspots, as well as average crash risk. Kind of a theme throughout this presentation is that we need to be looking beyond crash history to be thinking about risk. We need to be focusing on our equity areas and also not neglecting our downtowns and town centers, despite the fact that the county is predominantly suburban. While most of this presentation is really focused on what are the safety challenges and how do we better understand the safety issues in Montgomery County, This last part is going to focus on, well, how do we make improvements and what are the solutions that we can look to improve safety? And so as part of this project, we looked at about 15 different safety countermeasures. This is by no means the whole world of safety countermeasures. Montgomery County actually put out a Vision Zero toolkit with about 40 safety countermeasures. So this is just an excerpt of that we looked at as part of the predictive safety analysis. And many of these are some of those lower cost systemic safety improvements. So what we did with this information is we developed some dynamic Excel tools that allowed us to evaluate different countermeasure scenarios. So we could look at how many crashes would be reduced by implementing these improvements, what would be the cost per crash reduced. So this allows us to kind of better understand the cost effectiveness. We worked with our partners at the Department of Transportation to get cost estimates for each countermeasure. And then lastly, we looked at the percent of locations in equity emphasis areas. So better understanding, will this investment scenario advance equity and help close some of the gaps that we see in the data. And these tools also allow you to print a list of the top ranked location for each scenario that you study. So I'm just going to walk through one example of how this can be used. So first we looked at reducing those angle crashes and say hypothetically we had $350,000. The first option in which we could do is to increase the all red clearance time. This is a signal timing change that increases the time that all the vehicles at the intersection, at a signalized intersection, have a red light. And so given that this is a relatively simple change, it's changing the signal timing but doesn't require new infrastructure, we could do this at over 100 locations with our $350,000. The next option that we looked at was shifting some intersections from side street stop to all-way stop. And again, because installing a stop sign is not a relatively expensive feature, we could do this at 70 locations, given the $350,000 in this example. And so the last item here, kind of used for contrast, is a traffic signal. And these are a pretty expensive safety treatment or transportation improvement. And so we could really only do this at one location with our $350,000. And so what you see here is that given kind of how many locations we can do this low cost treatment of increasing all clearance time, we really make a big improvement in reducing crashes. We can reduce crashes by almost 2,600 over a 10-year period. And the cost per crash reduced, given how many locations we can touch and how many crashes are reduced, is very, very low. In contrast, when we look at, the traffic signal, we make a really big impact at the one location that it's improved. We reduce crashes by 47 over that 10-year period, which is higher than any given intersection for the all red clearance time. However, that's the whole benefit, right? We're not seeing that aggregate benefit of doing this improvement at 116 locations. And so we really see the predictive safety analysis as the first step or the foundation for moving forward with a proactive approach to safety. This is, a data-driven approach that can be applied in supporting how we identify recommendations, potentially mitigation for new development, how we prioritize improvements. And this can be used in a variety of ways. We can think about how do we prioritize capital improvement program funding. When we have some funding programs that are just for sidewalks or just for crosswalks, how do we prioritize where those sidewalks and crosswalks are built? Are we doing it in a data-driven way that is really going to kind of be the best bang for our buck in improving safety? And then lastly, given that my role in working on this project was through the planning department, we're thinking about how we can use this information to inform master planning and regulatory review. And then finally, we see this as a mechanism to really provide data in support of future grant applications. And so just want to thank you all for your time. I really appreciate being part of this Walkinar, and I look forward to the discussion to follow. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Jesse, and thanks everybody, Stephanie and Carden as well, and thanks to everybody who submitted questions. We got many already, and we'll go through them for the next 20 or 35 minutes. And if you have any other questions, as John has been reminding you in the chat, you can submit them in the questions tab, and we'll ask our presenters to put their cameras on. And there's Jesse and there's Stephanie, and I'm sure Carden will be with us momentarily. Excellent. So I'm gonna, just to get started here, I guess, a couple questions for you, Stephanie, from the beginning of your presentation, from Natalie Bilwak-Whitty, who's asking, When we think of TOD, how are we ensuring that this density, which also involves more noise, has homes designed to minimize the negative impacts of this noise? And you're muted.
Of course I am. So that's really a design question. So if you're talking about noise, if you're talking about, street noise for, I guess the question is, what are you talking about, the impact of noise on the residents or the impact of the residents on creating noise in an area? But from the idea that, if you're living in an area where there is noise, that can be mitigated through design, through the design of buildings and so forth. If you're talking about more about creating noise, most of these places you want activity. So noise is part of what you're creating, and that is part of the lifeblood of an active location.
Great, thank you. She also had a follow-up for you, which is for Metuchen, how do we ensure that there's equitable access, such as opportunities for low-income individuals, particularly youth, just starting out, to live in that community as well?
So that's a really big question now that I think people who are concerned with TOD are really thinking about. There's a lot of work that's being done, not so much of it here in New Jersey, although there's a lot of work being done in other parts of the country to think about how you make sure that you preserve places that are affordable and that are already affordable in places that are transit served. You also inclusionary zoning are ways to make sure that you have affordable housing built in new construction. Really it comes down to using a number of levers. Funding for new development often has to be tied to including affordable units. I think we need to think about the size of units so that people can provide more units at a lower price point. There's a whole host of levers that need to be thought about when developing the kind of housing that needs to go into TOD areas.
Great, thank you. Cardin, I think your camera is off, but I do have a question for you, assuming you're there. Is she there, John? Or she dropped off? Looks like she may have dropped off briefly. Okay, she may be having some technical issues. So while we get that resolved, I'm going to move forward with the question for Jesse. And that is, if our jurisdiction wanted to get started to do a predictive safety analysis, what would be the first steps to start it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first you want to kind of take a look at your data, and I think, it was a really big part of our project was just collecting and compiling all of the data. And so, I think ensuring that you have crash data and, does that crash data provide you with information about who was involved, maybe how that crash occurred. In addition, you want to be looking at that land use and transportation data. So what data do you already have about your roadway network? I think often bicycle and pedestrian data can be pretty poor in some jurisdictions. So if you don't already have, a sidewalk inventory or kind of an inventory of your bike lanes or your speed limits and things like that, I think that can be really helpful as a first step. And then I think the first thing you want to do is essentially just look at some descriptive statistics about where your crashes are occurring relative to different types of attributes of the roadway. So are you seeing that your crashes are more common on 6-lane roads versus 4-lane roads, or depending on the speed limit? And so I think you can jump in and kind of do the whole, developing of safety performance functions, but a first step might be compiling the data and doing some systemic analysis to understand what are the trends that we're seeing in our community. Are we seeing that, our urban areas are where those crashes are most common, or is it our suburban, a more suburban or residential part of our community? And so I think that could be a helpful first step to help you understand where you want to learn more.
Great, thanks, Jesse. We do have a number of questions for you. We also have some questions for Cardin, but she seems to be having some technical difficulties. So just FYI to both you and Stephanie as we kind of work through this process. But we do have many questions, so we'll just keep going through them. Our next one is from Evelyn Bryant Ward, who asks, I live in the town of La Plata here in Maryland. We have a state road that runs through our downtown area. We have pedestrian crosswalks, but they're often not honored by drivers. Have you been successful in getting resolutions to issues like this for pedestrian safety?
So it sounds like the issue that you're talking about is kind of lack of compliance from the motorists at those crosswalks. You know, I think there are definitely efforts that you can take around education and enforcement to improve driver behavior at those locations. But I think we also, you know, part of Vision Zero and the safe systems approach is understanding that people are going to make mistakes and they're not always going to make the decision that's kind of in the best interest of all the other road users around them. And so I think some of it might be considering what are the other infrastructure improvements we need at these intersections to, I don't want to say force compliance, but, you know, say that crossing, that pedestrian crossing currently doesn't have a stop sign and require vehicles to stop, you know, installing a stop sign at that location, you know, could increase driver compliance because compliance with a stop sign is likely much higher than at just a marked crosswalk. And similarly, you may determine that other treatments to make it a more protected crossing, like an RRFB or a rectangular rapid flashing beacon or something like a hawk signal, can kind of really improve the visibility of the pedestrian trying to cross at that location and increase the compliance of the motor vehicles. But also those are kind of relatively new treatments, and so there definitely has to be some education with motorists about kind of how to react to seeing kind of a new signal type on the roadway.
I would also just follow up on what Jesse said, was that you should also be thinking about whether or not the roadway has the right speed limit on it, because, you know, one of the things is, I think, that compliance, you know, if the prevailing speed at which drivers are on the roadway is faster than really the roadway should have, given that it's a pedestrian crossing, that would be something that I would look at as well.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Next one here is also for Jesse. It's a little bit longer question, so I'll read it a little slowly so you can absorb what we're saying here. It's great to see the more proactive element of the risk assessment, but can you point to some of the common characteristics that emerged in the category of high crash risk, but low observed crashes? Did these tend to be suburban or near transit stations? And aside from identifying them via crash types, are there other context concerns that such places have in common?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't done a deep dive in looking at what are the locations that fell into that category. I think we've really kind of just emphasized if it had high crash risk, we need to be focusing more on those locations. I think likely, you know, across the board, what we saw as high crash risk is not going to be surprising to many people on this call. You know, locations with high volumes, high speeds, high number of lanes, you know, often limited pedestrian and bicycle facilities. And so I imagine some that fall into that high crash risk, low observed, likely fall into that category, but I don't have kind of a specific answer for how those are unique relative to those that both had high observed and high crash risk.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm just going to keep asking you questions because a lot of them were relative to yours and we still don't have Carden back. Next one is from Sharon Gita, who's asking, what portion of the proposed investment in countermeasures includes pedestrian and driver safety education?
So this project focused primarily on infrastructure improvements. The countermeasures that we looked at are all those that are in kind of this countermeasure clearinghouse that show national research demonstrating the ability of these infrastructure improvements to reduce the number of expected crashes. There definitely are, you know, education strategies that can reduce crashes and be effective, but that's not something that we identified as part of this project. And I guess I'll note that, you know, we were coming at this as the planning department, and so our role is really kind of thinking more from that infrastructure perspective, but our partners at the Department of Transportation, you know, both think about the infrastructure as well as how are we incorporating education, enforcement, and some of those other factors.
Okay, thank you. Sharon also had another question, which is, what part of these studies address the number of pedestrian crashes that are attributable to pedestrian error, such as crossing in the middle of the street instead of at crosswalks, crossing against the signal at intersections, and wearing dark clothing in the evening, and so on?
I'll kick this off, but Stephanie may want to chime in as well after that. As part of this project, we didn't look at kind of any level of fault by pedestrians or motorists specifically. I think that often when fault is attributed, that's very subjective. It's based on, the police officer at the time recording what occurred at the crash. And so we really focused on kind of the very objective elements of what had occurred. We also know that there are reasons why people choose not to cross at the crosswalk, right? There could be public safety reasons. Maybe they don't feel comfortable in a certain area crossing at that location. It may be that there's not marked crosswalks for a half-mile stretch and no one's, reasonably going to walk 10 minutes out of their way to cross at the crosswalk and walk 10 minutes back. So, we do know that there are a variety of reasons why people make choices that may not align with what is perfect pedestrian behavior. And again, part of Vision Zero is assuming that people are going to make mistakes and that people are not always going to kind of follow what is, 100% best practice. So I don't know, Stephanie, do you want to chime in?
I think you covered a lot of what I was going to say. I also know that there was some recent research out of Rutgers, some of my colleagues here, looking at how the police sort of saw the incident and how they recorded it, and how training of police to think a little bit differently about not blaming pedestrians when there are pedestrian crashes, thinking about really what happened and not thinking about whether or not someone is dressed in dark clothing or so forth. That tends not to be really helpful in making improvements. The one other thing that occurred to me is that while it's safer to cross at a crosswalk, generally speaking, it's not illegal to not cross at a crosswalk as long as you're walking, in a straightforward manner across the roadway. So, I would rather not think, people behave in ways that work well for them. Jesse was saying a half mile down the road is not the kind of, you're not going to go out of your way in order to make a crossing. So.
Thanks, Stephanie, and welcome back, Cardin. I know you were having a little technical difficulty there.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I had to restart my old computer and everything. My bad.
Well, welcome back. We did get
Thank you.
several questions for you, so I'll just ask you a few because we were holding them while we were waiting for you to come back. So
thank you. Appreciate it.
Able to fix that. So this question is from Kyle James, who's asking, can you expand on your preference for the type of curb ramps that work best for you?
Well, ideally no curbs. And I know that's starting to be a thing actually in a lot of plaza areas and stuff, of this idea of kind of shared streets. They do it a lot in Europe, where they're curbless. And honestly, that would be the most ideal thing ever. Obviously, it's not practical in every situation. So with curb ramp, obviously make sure it's ADA slope, and then ensuring that there are high contrast tactical warning plates that are in the actual direction of travel of the crosswalk. So those tactile guide plates or warning strips, whatever you want to call them, if they are diagonal, or if they're placed diagonally and the crosswalk is, say, at a 90-degree angle, it's going to divert those that rely on that, such as those who are blind or have low vision. They are using walking canes. They will walk in the direction of that and walk right into traffic, which is actually really scary. So ensuring that your contractors and your Department of Transportation knows the right placement of those. So 2 perpendicular curbs or curb cuts is usually ideal.
It's also important to make decisions about the materials that last over time, so that the contrast continues to exist, a couple years down the road, that it isn't just when you first install the curb cut.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Our next question here is from Kathy Lewis, who's asking, I think it was primarily Carden, but maybe the other two, you would like to also respond. And that is, how do you feel about the outdoor dining that has appeared with the pandemic? The outdoor dining that appeared in Arlington, Virginia has come at the expense of a clear path for pedestrians. It often seems too narrow for wheelchairs.
Yeah, great question, and thank you so much for that. So with the outdoor dining, also can be placemaking projects, as what we see popping up all over the country. So it's extremely important that you have guidelines in those allowances. I don't know if it's a permitting process. I know in Atlanta it's a permitting process. Depends on which jurisdiction you're in. But making sure that you still have the right of way for pedestrian traffic and making sure that it doesn't block the widths of wheelchairs. So I know in Atlanta it's illegal if you don't provide the proper wheelchair accessibility access onto the placemaking, but also walking sidewalk. So if you're going to take over a couple of car spaces that are on street parking, that typically happens. One of the pictures that I showed was ensuring that there was a smooth flush threshold so that it was level, so that you're basically bringing the level of the actual outdoor dining to the at grade of the sidewalk. But yeah, a lot of cities don't regulate it, and I know it's definitely a problem in the New York City area. I've seen a lot of tweets about the issues around that. So having a permitting process. Does Stephanie or Jesse, do you guys have any experience with that? I'm sure maybe you see that.
So generally in New Jersey, you do have to have a permit in order to have outdoor dining. And we have seen a lot of course, through the pandemic, we've seen a big expansion of that. We've also seen the reuse of, or the repurposing of street for various uses, outdoor uses, some of which have, of course, have just, have not now or not being used in that way. But many communities are actually trying to reclaim that space in order, because they've learned through the pandemic that these spaces are contribute to really great places. You've brought up the term placemaking. That's certainly part of what we do, part of the things that we think about for transit-friendly places. And using some of the street space for those purposes is important.
Great, thank you. Our next question is here from Deborah Meyerson. Hi, Deborah. What have been the your most effective methods to advocate, and this is for Carden, to advocate proactively for the best policy and practice in accessible transportation and mobility with public agencies?
Yeah, going through the grassroots organizations and the nonprofits is what my angle has been, but additionally a lot of tweeting. Our city government is pretty responsive on Twitter, so it's been really helpful. I serve on the board of directors of a nonprofit that focuses on safe streets and safe sidewalks, bike lanes, transit-oriented development, and so on. And then one that's dedicated specifically on with our metropolitan rapid transit and buses. Forming partnerships is probably the best thing. Showing up to town halls, speaking at community meetings, and so on, getting your name out there. I will say I'm kind of known as the wheelchair user in Atlanta that often speaks boldly and loudly about pedestrian experiences. And it's really important that we have people with disabilities on all those organizations and those community meetings, making sure that our voice is heard as well, because it's, we're part of the conversation. And then having those good relationships with your city council members to help legislation and policies, having good relationships with your state department as well, making sure that you have those relationships as well. I will say a lot of people don't show up to the town halls and the transportation meetings at City Hall. And so it's a great place to give your public comment, share the experiences, and yeah.
working on the other end. I'm often the person who is waiting there for the public to come and speak and show up, basically show up, have a voice and show up and tell us what you need and what you want and so forth. And that's the biggest step that people can take.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Next question here is also for you. And that is, can you provide local governments guidance on what steps they should take in evaluating their plans and local policies to improve access to transit for people with disabilities?
So I don't have a list in my head about what exact steps to take, but it is a great question. I think the thing to think of most importantly is that everyone should be able to get to where they need to go. And so you need to think about it from, the point of view of access for people of all abilities. So one of my slides, I showed, a wheelchair user and a person rolling a cart. Both of those people need the streets to work. And so you need to, basically walk the route, really think about the network and look at what's there. And, Jesse spoke about doing an inventory, sidewalk inventory. I think a lot of places don't have them. And so it's a really good first step in order to understanding how people get where they need to go. Everyone needs to be able to utilize the sidewalk and to get throughout the network. And that's where I would probably start.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just
Nancy,
add to that quickly?
Go ahead, absolutely.
I just wanted to add that Montgomery County is currently working on a pedestrian master plan, and I think accessibility is kind of front and center in that master plan. And so I can send John the link to share with the broader group, but a handful of kind of recommendations, are around additional sidewalk maintenance and not waiting for requests to improve some of these locations, but having a more systematic approach to reviewing the quality of these sidewalks so that they can, again, this is an equity issue, right? If we just rely on people who make requests, we're not going to necessarily be improving the locations that are most important. I think Cardin talked about policies around construction. And I think, if your jurisdiction doesn't have policies around accommodation during construction, that's another thing to consider, as well as just obstructions in the sidewalk. Occasionally you see like the utility pole or a bench and things like that. And so what are the policies that, you've put in place regarding kind of a clear zone for the sidewalk? And so that's just a few of those examples, but I can try to share more in the chat.
One additional thing to think about, and this has more to do with access for people with disabilities than for transit per se, is that, jurisdictions really should have an ADA, a plan for meeting their ADA requirements if they don't have one already in place. And so part of that is doing the kind of evaluation that Jesse was just talking about, looking where there's obstructions and so forth. And it can be kind of a heavy lift in order to make that kind of make those observations, but it's really important. So.
Thank you. Here's another one for Jesse from Richard Woodruff, who's saying, the cost analysis that you shared seems very high for the signal timing change and for installing four-way stops. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So I guess to confirm, it sounds like you think that the cost estimates that we have for signal timing change, which I think was around $3,000, and for the always stop, which I can't do the fast math in my head, was probably maybe about twice that, maybe $5,000 to $7,000, seemed high. I'm a planner, not an engineer, and so we really relied on the Montgomery County Department of Transportation for those cost estimates. And so I imagine, that's based on their experience in Montgomery County. I don't know that that's, necessarily going to be the same in your community. Maybe the signal timing change is high, given kind of coordination with multiple signals along a corridor. If you're going to make a change at one location and you have kind of a progression or a green wave, you might need to be doing that at multiple locations, and that could increase the cost. But I can't provide much more detail on how those cost estimates were developed.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from Conrad Olmedo, who's asking, do to the panel generally, do you have any suggestions for a site plan reviewer when it comes to encouraging non-required pedestrian enhancements to a project when facing resistance from the development community?
So I think what you're asking is that there are some amenities that you would like to have and put in place that would serve pedestrians, but because you haven't required them they're not part of sort of the required package of things that a developer needs to do, you're getting pushback from a developer. I think that's kind of where the question is going. And I think the thing to do, I mean, there's a couple of different ways to go about it. But that often development is a negotiated process. And so these are things that you can ask for in that negotiation. The other thing is that, the projects that we've been observing and my experience is that oftentimes these things are actually to the benefit of developers as well. And so doing that education and making that that argument can go a long way, and having actually a good working relationship with the development community rather than always a confrontational one can go a long way to making improvements that you might not otherwise get while working on new development.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Nancy Holbert, who's asking, how do we get started on a Safe Routes to School program when there are no existing sidewalks in our town? Do any of you want to take that one on?
No, but I'd love to put you in touch with one of my colleagues who actually works in this area. And if you reach out, I can make that happen. The question is, are people walking anyway? If you have no sidewalks, but people are walking anyway, you need to be looking at those places and looking at ways of making them safer. It's not, I mean, Cardin spoke a little bit about shared streets before, and certainly there's the opportunity to think about streets as being safer for pedestrians even when there are no sidewalks. And so that would probably be the first thing I would start looking at. And I would start looking at the locations near schools and what can be done, quicker, faster, cheaper, whatever that particular phrase is, to make things safer for people moving and, walking and rolling in that area, biking in that area.
Yeah, and Stephanie, I'd also like to add, starting with your local pedestrian organization or nonprofit advocacy group, we have started that as well with Propel ATL, and evaluating all of the City of Atlanta schools and understanding where the current challenges are, and helping to shape that policy and prioritization with the state and city departments. Because ultimately, the voices of the kids really do matter, right?
Absolutely. Cardin, I know you may want to be off camera for a couple minutes while you're getting some technology resolved. We will be wrapping up in a couple minutes, so you may want to do that, and then when you come back, we'll probably have closing thoughts with you. But our next question here is from Emma Perez for Jesse, which is, the topic of preventative accidents is personally timely. I live in a neighborhood in Maryland that seems to present an area of high crash risk and low crash observed. The roads that need mediation are used as cut-through traffic, and now my neighbors are avoiding cycling and walking these intersections, which in return seems to encourage drivers' bad behaviors. What steps can I take to bring resources to this area where my family and my neighbors live? And if you can point me in the right direction, as this topic will be discussed by the neighbors in our next meeting. Very specific question.
Great question. I mean, I think that some of the items that Cardin and Stephanie shared generally around, how to get involved, apply to this question as well. Showing up to meetings and kind of being an advocate for these issues. I also think that, I think earlier in the chat it was shared, but I shared a Vision Zero community toolkit that has about 40 different bicycle and pedestrian safety treatments and kind of different contexts in which they can be applied to improve safety. And so that could be a good step or a tool you all could look at to kind of identify what do we want to see, you know, what might be reasonable at this location, and what do we want to kind of ask of our local government. And then, yeah, I mean, I think that my presentation focused a lot on data, but I also think that, you know, the more qualitative human side of the story can be really effective. And so I think to the extent that you can kind of have people show up and kind of talk about what their personal experience is in that community and how, you know, it's challenging to get around, or it's, you know, affected your quality of life in this way or that way, can be a really effective way to get your point across.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for Stephanie. Says it's here. The New Jersey TOD newsletter is a great way to share information for stakeholders trying to advance transit-oriented development. Can you point to any best practices for more localized efforts for organizing or providing a regular forum to cultivate relationships and to help inform and implement more accessible and equitable TOD?
A local forum. So I mean, without knowing sort of the geography and what you're talking about, there are, I mean, in various locations, there are definitely groups, advocacy groups and so forth that are looking at equitable TOD and so forth. In New Jersey, I don't have anything to draw on particularly that's looking specifically at that. Chicago has a great organization that has been working on this area, and that might be something to look at. But you know, really the people working in affordable housing and so forth are also thinking about these things. So that would be another area in which you can look, looking at the local affordable housing groups and so forth. Sorry, I had one other thought about what Jesse had said before, but it seems to have escaped me. So.
That's okay. We'll just have a couple more questions here before we wrap, but here's one I think kind of related from Cheryl Martin, who's a planner up in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And her question is about micro-transportation and TOD walkshed extensions. How do you calculate or determine the amount a TOD walkshed distance to transit can be extended by using microtransit? Is it based on the user experience? Maybe people will only travel an additional 5 minutes, or is it a more general calculation?
So we haven't done that. We haven't done that detailed research yet. That's actually something that I think is really on the cutting edge of what people are looking at now, and starting to collect data on how much further people are walking. But I think you can look at the bike research at least as, you know, sort of the baseline of what that might be. I don't have a number right on, you know, I think the jury's still out on like what the walkshed would really be. I think, you know, when I refer to quarter mile, half mile, that's, you know, these are just sort of rules of thumb that people are using, and that really looking at an area and how far people are walking based on the conditions is really the best way of thinking about what a TOD area might be considered. But microtransit definitely is, you know, one of those things that are expanding our thoughts about what a transit area is and what we should be thinking about in the future.
Great, thank you. And here's one from Raymond Tomzak, who's asking, has anyone assessed how to improve bicycle and pedestrian access to transit stations in terms of identifying those corridors or places in transit systems that might be most in need of improvements? And if so, can you describe the process that you used?
So I think what you're talking about is looking at a systematic approach to looking at bike sheds or bike infrastructure going to transit systems. So we've done some of that work, and I could probably, if, you know, I don't have the resource in the back of my head, but I can point, if you contact me afterwards, I can point you to that research.
Okay, and I think we'll ask this one last question, which is, how do we account for users who are blind and who are actually helped by curbs, sometimes as a guide?
Yeah, I can take this. So talking again about the tactical warning strips. So those are usually where plated with the little bumps on them. Some people think they're really annoying and don't know why they're there, but those are actually there specifically for those who have low vision or who are blind. And when someone is using a walking cane, they put the cane out in front of them and they drag it across left and right motion, zigzag motion. And what they're doing is they're detecting changes in textures of the ground. And so when it comes across those tactical warning strips, it's able to detect those bumps. And so it signals to the user, hey, you're approaching an intersection. Hey, this is a danger. Proceed with caution. Wait until you hear the hawk signal or the walk symbol, or whatever, if it's audible, and ensuring that those are also perpendicular and directly in the path of travel of the painted crosswalk. So if they're angled or if they're non-existing, it can deter people from safely crossing the roads. As such. Additionally, I've seen other cities will provide additional textures, or they'll do indents in the concrete about a few feet in front of the actual curb cut. And so that's another measure in place to help indicate to the user that, hey, you're approaching a sidewalk or crosswalk, and to proceed with caution.
Yeah, I think what Carden is really talking about is, we can think about design a little bit more broadly also, that like if you're talking about textures on the horizontal surface, that it doesn't have to be a curve. It can be there can be another physical indication of a space that can be detected. So. Yeah,
100%. If you're thinking about just universal access in every situation, I think Stephanie and Jesse, you guys were both talking about that, is how do you add more textures? How do you add more contrast? It really creates high quality streets. It creates high quality areas that people really want to live and thrive and be in. And it's not just individuals who have disabilities, but it's really a benefit to everyone.
Great, thank you. Well, we've run out of time. It's already noon here at Eastern time. So thanks everybody for submitting questions, but we did want to give each of our panelists a chance for some kind of final thoughts and takeaways. And if we may, we'll start with you, Jesse, then Carden, and then Stephanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Stephanie and Carden for bringing to light a lot of issues around accessibility and universal design. I think that's often overlooked when we talk about pedestrian safety and pedestrian issues. And, the study that I shared focused a lot about data, and, we're lacking data about pedestrian issues more broadly, but definitely lacking a lot of information around the quality of our sidewalks, where the curb ramps exist, et cetera. And so, kind of one place to start when you're thinking about these issues is just understanding what you have in your local community. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie and Jesse as well. We have such a great diverse, we had data, we had the experience, and then we also just had, what the high quality streetscapes look like. And so getting connected with your local advocacy groups, understanding their perspective and point of view. And then you can connect with me on Twitter at Carden on Wheels. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Jesse, Carden, it was a pleasure to hear both of you speak. I really got a lot out of both of your talks today, and I was really happy to be able to talk about the work that I do, and really the interconnection between the ideas of access to transit and the needs of people of all abilities, and really how they come together is really very important to me. And I hope to hear from people who participated on this call. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks everybody. With that, we're going to conclude our webinar, Expanding Access to Pedestrian Infrastructure and Improving Public Safety, Tools and Case Studies. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Stephanie DiPetrillo, Carden Wyckoff, and Jesse Cohn-McGowan for a great presentation. To everyone who attended today and the more than 6,000 people who registered for the Walkinars this year. to Francine Waters of the Maryland Department of Transportation, who organized the Walkinar panels and has done so with us for the past 3 years. And to my colleague, John Coleman, our communications guru, who helps to make this look easy every time we do a program. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org later today. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on future webinars, including preparing critical infrastructure for climate change, water utilities leading the way, hosted by Jason DeVoe of the Maryland Department of Planning, which will be next Friday, November 4th. Finally, thank you to the more than 80,000 people who have attended our Smart Growth Network webinar since 2017. With that, I wish everyone a great day and see you next time.